Hello, I'm Lisa Valerio, the founder and president of the Phoenicia Foundation. On behalf of myself and the board, we'd like to thank you for listening to this webinar that is part 3 of a 6-week series on the important role of nonverbal communication. This webinar is presented by 2 amazing and passionate speech pathologists, Luna DeCurtis and Dawn Ferreira. Part 3, they will cover the breakdowns in nonverbal communication for various populations. This series would not be possible if it was not for our sponsors, Silicon Valley Bank Foundation and the Lewis Greenwood Foundation. Phoenicia Foundation is so honored by their support and all our volunteers and donors who help us achieve our mission in helping special needs children, their families, and their communities thrive. If interested in learning more about Phoenicia Foundation, visit our website at www.phoeniciafoundation.org. I will now share my screen. I'm going to go.
Welcome to part 3 of our series on nonverbal communication. Today we'll be talking about the breakdowns in nonverbal communication for various populations. So during part 1, we talked about what nonverbal communication is, what it looks like, especially during that first year. In part 2, we gave examples of nonverbal communication across the lifespan. And then we discussed how different populations use it for different purposes. But with every skill, there are challenges. And if they say that 90% of the message is nonverbal, well, then what happens when populations are challenged to either use or decipher those messages? Have you ever gotten that mixed message from someone? Maybe they're saying one thing, but you think they mean something else. Or they're saying, yes, I love it, but their facial expression kind of shows something different. Or they're saying, yes, I feel comfortable, but their body language shows something different. Well, we'll be talking about some populations where you see these challenges, such as children with visual impairments, children with attention deficit disorders, and children with social communication disorders. So sometimes it might be hard to see nonverbal communication in facial expressions or body language. Like if you have a visual impairment, maybe you can't distinguish between the subtle differences between someone saying, hey, I want it, or someone saying, can I have it, right? Just with that hand. Or maybe someone using their fingers like this versus meaning come here versus no, don't do that, versus look over there, right? Versus, hey, good job. You might not be able to distinguish those, and certainly different eye movements might be hard to distinguish as well. Sending a message like, hey, look over there. Just sending that with your eyes might be really hard to tell. Or sending a message such as, no, don't say that. As we try to send with our eyes sometimes, kind of a universal mom motion, well, that might be hard, again, for someone with visual impairments to decipher. So maybe they can't see it versus a child with attention deficit order who might be able to see it, but can't actually sustain it. So when I'm in therapy and I want the child to look at my mouth to see where the sounds are made and how they're produced, sometimes my children with attention deficit disorders are just scanning my face and looking back at what they're doing and a different object. They can't actually watch the whole movement. Or maybe I'm trying to show them something that's going on and I'm trying to explain it with gestures, but they're having a hard time even sustaining proximity and they need to get up and move or leave. Or maybe they're tuning into what I'm saying and I'm saying, hey, we're going to do these 3 things, right? 1, 2, 3. And even though I might be showing them, they might not really be paying that much attention to it because they may be thinking about their own agenda or their own plan, what they're going to do and say. So now what about children with social communication disorders? They might be able to see it and they might even be able to stay there and sustain it, but they might not understand what it means. They just can't interpret it. And certainly that is a hallmark of social communication disorders, not being able to use nonverbal communication or understand it. So This can be seen in the most basic ways, like we said, in that first year when social communication and social relationships are being fostered, when other kids come too close. Children with social communication disorders might not know what to do or might not feel comfortable. Even a simple gesture like a wave, that child might not know how to respond. Or even a loving gesture, arms open to come, a child with a social communication disorder might not want to follow up on that. They might not be able to understand when the teacher just sits there with hands on the hips in frustration, or even when teachers, are giving a thumbs up. They might not know how to interpret that, and they certainly might not know when other people are maybe tired of listening to them on a particular topic, and maybe the listener is kind of leaning back, maybe looking at a watch, or kind of showing a movement that they have to go. All of those breakdowns and not being able to understand social communication really hinder those social relationships. And certainly they might not be able to use it. They might be saying that they are tired, but they don't look it. Or they might be trying to act like they're fine, but their voice and their facial features sound very angry. So you might not be seeing a real connection with what they're saying and what they're feeling and what they're showing. So these are just some examples. Dawn, do you have a few more?
Yeah, so, individuals with neurological conditions and disorders such as cerebral palsy, ALS, and Parkinson's may have limited or restricted control over the facial muscles, as we talked about the importance of a smile and how much that conveys, and bodily movements that are involved in producing nonverbal actions. Sometimes there are tics and involuntary movements of the body that accompany these conditions, and they might be perceived as intentional nonverbal communication, but aren't. They're tics, they're involuntary. Often intentional nonverbal communications are embedded within the involuntary tics and movements and may cause breakdowns in communication and increase frustration for those individuals with these conditions attempting to communicate nonverbally. They may be able to understand and interpret the nonverbal communications of others, but not have access to using intentional nonverbal communication effectively. Now, there are some individuals who might present with a flat affect as a result of a stroke or other conditions and may have difficulty demonstrating emotionality with the facial expressions, or have limited use of an extremity to gesture with. I think it's important to be aware of this fact that when you're talking to someone with restricted or impaired movement, just because they might not be able to effectively utilize and produce nonverbal communication effectively, doesn't mean that they can't read, understand, and interpret your subtle or overt nonverbal communication. Assume that they can. We, as the communicative partner, might not receive the full intention behind the message in the absence of the nonverbals and perhaps limited or impaired verbal output. However, they might be receiving your full message and intent with your nonverbal. So just be aware of that. Now, some people who rely on the use of an augmentative or alternative communication device to communicate, they might not be able to pair a facial expression or gesture with that type of communication system, or it might not be delivered simultaneously with the voice output of a talker or the visual of a picture. This could also cause a breakdown in the understanding of the intent, tone, and meaning, since the nonverbal communication is largely responsible for conveying those messages. As Luna mentioned, about 90% of the message, the intent, is conveyed through nonverbals. Additionally, there are individuals who use wheelchairs, walkers, or other assistive movement devices that can restrict the parts of the body involved in nonverbal communication. That can cause a further breakdown in communication. We can all relate to breakdowns in communication due to the lack of nonverbals, such as when we are texting with people and we're reading just the words, we're not hearing the tone of the voice, and we're not seeing any kind of nonverbal gesture that goes along with that. We all, I think, understand how frustrating that can be. And again, yes, you might be able to use an emoji, but it just doesn't cut it in terms of conveying the information.
I think that's a good point. And I think about how phones themselves can be part of the breakdown in nonverbal communication. When I'm looking down and I say, yep, I'm listening, but I'm looking down, or you're telling me something that is important to you, but I'm constantly checking maybe my watch or constantly looking at my computer screen. I think those right now are some of the biggest breakdowns in nonverbal communication for all populations.
Luna, I really want to agree with you on that, because as people are looking down at their phone or other screens, they might say, I'm listening to you. I'm listening to you, but you're not receiving the full message because you're not seeing my facial expression or my gestures.
That's right. Yep. So thank you for joining us for part 3 on breakdowns. In part 4, we'll be moving to therapeutic intervention of nonverbal communication deficits. So please join us for that.